April 1943. The armored behemoths of the United States Army's 2nd Armored Division thundered across the Tunisian desert, their engines roaring in defiance against the North African heat. Inside the lead Sherman tank, Sergeant James Cullen squinted through his periscope at the ridgeline ahead. His mouth went dry as he spotted what every American tanker had learned to fear: the unmistakable silhouette of a German Tiger tank. "Gunner, AP round, Tiger at 11 o'clock, 800 yards, he barked. The Sherman's 75mm gun barked in response. The round streaked toward the enemy tank and struck squarely on its frontal armor, only to bounce off harmlessly like a pebble tossed against steel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Tiger's massive 88mm cannon swung toward Cullen's Sherman with mechanical precision. Time seemed to slow. Cullen knew what would happen next, the same thing that had happened to dozens of American tanks before. The Sherman's armor was too thin to withstand the Tiger's devastating punch. In the cramped confines of the tank, the 5-man crew held their breath. The German gun fired, the round punching through the Sherman's side armor as if it were cardboard. But instead of the expected explosion, something miraculous happened. The round penetrated the outer armor layer but deflected away from the crew compartment, exiting through the opposite side of the tank. Cullen stared in disbelief at the 2 neat holes in his tank's sides. They should be dead. Every man in the crew knew it, yet somehow they were still alive. What Cullen couldn't know was that his miraculous survival was no accident. It was the result of one American welder's unauthorized modification, a makeshift armor solution created from literal battlefield trash that would soon transform the Sherman from death trap to survivor, saving thousands of American lives in the process. The welder's name was Sergeant Curtis Geyer, a 34-year-old former Michigan auto worker who had joined the Army in 1941 with one valuable skill: the ability to cut and join metal with extraordinary precision. That skill, combined with battlefield ingenuity and sheer stubborn defiance of military bureaucracy, would save more American tankers' lives than any official improvement program could manage in the same time frame. The story begins not with triumph, but with tragedy. By early 1943, American forces had learned a brutal lesson about their primary battle tank. The M4 Sherman, which formed the backbone of American armored forces, was outmatched by German tanks in nearly every category that mattered. German Panther and Tiger tanks boasted superior armor and far more powerful guns. In combat, the results were devastating. American tankers grimly nicknamed their Shermans Ronsons, after the popular cigarette lighter, whose slogan promised it would light first every time, a dark reference to how easily the tanks caught fire when hit. The statistics were grim. A Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman from more than a mile away, while Shermans needed to close to within a few hundred yards to have any chance of penetrating a Tiger's armor. American casualties mounted. By some estimates, the Shermans suffered a 75% loss rate in their early North African engagements with German armor. Behind each cold statistic was a human tragedy. 5-man crews burned alive inside their steel coffins. The problem wasn't unknown to American commanders or the War Department. Reports streamed back from the front lines describing the Sherman's inadequacies in excruciating detail. Sergeant Curtis Geyer witnessed this carnage firsthand. As a maintenance welder with the 2nd Armored Division's Support Battalion, his job was to repair damaged tanks and return them to combat. But increasingly, the Shermans that came back to his repair depot weren't damaged. They were destroyed, often with their crews still inside, burned beyond recognition. "I've pulled too many dead boys out of these tin cans," he wrote in a letter home to his wife in February 1943. "Something's got to change or we're going to lose this war one tank crew at a time." The official response was frustratingly slow. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department acknowledged the problem, but explained that redesigning and manufacturing improved armor would take months, possibly years. New tanks with better armor were in development, but production realities meant they wouldn't reach the front until 1944 at the earliest. In the meantime, American tankers would simply have to make do. The military bureaucracy, with its forms, committees, and approval processes, couldn't move fast enough to save lives being lost daily on the battlefield. Gaia refused to accept this reality. During his pre-war years at the Fisher Body plant in Detroit, he had learned that sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones. One evening in March 1943, while surveying the vast vehicle graveyard behind his repair depot in Tunisia, Gaia had an epiphany. The desert was littered with destroyed German tanks and vehicles, their armor plate superior to anything the Americans had. If we can't make better armor, Gaia later recalled thinking, maybe we can borrow some. That night, without authorization, Gaia and 3 other maintenance soldiers took cutting torches to a destroyed Panzer IV tank. They carefully halvaged sections of the German tank's frontal armor plate, which was nearly twice as thick as the Shermans. By morning, they had collected several hundred pounds of German armor. The next challenge was how to use it. Simply welding it onto a Sherman would add too much weight, potentially overstraining the engine and transmission. Gaia needed a more elegant solution. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source: medieval history. Before the war, Gaia had been an amateur military history enthusiast, with a particular interest in medieval armor. He recalled how knights had discovered that angled armor was more effective at deflecting blows than flat plates. A blade hitting at an angle would slide off instead of penetrating, he explained in a post-war interview. I figured the same principle would work for tank shells. Gaia sketched his idea. Additional armor plates would be welded to the Sherman, but at carefully calculated angles designed to deflect incoming rounds rather than stop them outright. The armor wouldn't need to be as thick if it could redirect the enemy's shells. He created a prototype using scrap metal on a damaged Sherman, focusing on the tank's most vulnerable areas, the sides of the hull and the ammunition storage areas. These were precisely the areas most frequently penetrated by German fire, resulting in the catastrophic brewing up that killed so many American crews. The modified Sherman looked strange, almost haphazard, with angular metal sections welded at seemingly random positions. Other maintenance workers nicknamed it Gaia's Frankentank. But would it work? The question was academic until April 7, 1943, when Gaia's unauthorized experiment rolled back into the repair depot with 2 clean holes punched through its side armor and a crew of 5 very much alive inside. It was Sergeant Cullen's tank, the one that had miraculously survived a direct hit from a Tiger. Your crazy trash armor saved our lives, Cullen told Gaia, still shaking from the encounter. The German shell went in one side and out the other without exploding. The angle made it change direction just enough to miss the ammunition rack by inches. Word spread quickly through the 2nd Armoured Division. Other tank crews began showing up at Gaia's repair depot, requesting the same modification. Gaia and his growing team of welders worked through the nights, scavenging armor from destroyed German vehicles and applying their improvised protection to as many Shermans as possible. Military hierarchy, however, soon took notice. Major Robert Thompson, the division's ordnance officer, inspected one of Gaia's modified tanks and immediately ordered a halt to the unauthorized modifications. This is a direct violation of equipment modification protocols, Thompson reportedly told Gaia. These tanks are government property, and unauthorized alterations are strictly prohibited. Gaia faced a difficult choice: follow orders and watch more young men die, or continue his work in secret. He chose the latter. The modifications continued, but now under cover of darkness and with the tacit approval of tank commanders, who were more concerned with surviving their next engagement than with regulatory compliance. Tank crews began, intentionally scheduling routine maintenance at night, when Gaia and his team could work without scrutiny from higher command. The Second Battle of El Guetar in late April 1943 provided the first large-scale test of Gaia's innovation. Sherman tanks equipped with the angular trash armor suffered significantly lower catastrophic destruction rates when hit. While the improvised armor couldn't stop direct hits from the most powerful German guns, it effectively reduced the number of tanks that experienced ammunition explosions, the deadliest outcome for tank crews. Crews in modified tanks who were hit reported higher survival rates, even when their vehicles were disabled. Colonel Michael Graham, commander of the 2nd Armoured Division's Combat Command, noticed the pattern after reviewing battle reports. Tanks from certain companies were returning from combat with damaged but intact crews, while others continued to suffer devastating losses. Graham investigated and discovered Guyer's unauthorized program, but unlike Major Thompson, Graham was a battlefield commander who measured success in lives saved rather than regulations followed. "I don't care if you're welding refrigerator doors onto these tanks," Graham allegedly told Guyer during a midnight inspection of the modification operation. "If it's keeping my boys alive, you have my authorization to continue." With Graham's protection, the program expanded rapidly. Guyer trained additional welders and standardized the modification process. The trash armor design was refined based on battlefield feedback, with particular attention paid to protecting the ammunition storage areas that were most vulnerable to catastrophic explosions. German intelligence noticed the change as well. A captured Wehrmacht report from May 1943 noted, "American tanks are now appearing with irregular armor configurations that reduce the effectiveness of our standard anti-tank tactics." Gunners report increased difficulty in achieving catastrophic kills against these modified vehicles. The report recommended targeting the Sherman's still vulnerable turret ring and engine compartment instead. By mid-May, Guyer's innovation had reached a critical milestone. Over 100 Shermans in the North African theatre had received the modification. Battle data was compelling. Modified tanks were experiencing a 40% reduction in catastrophic ammunition explosions when hit. More importantly, crew survival rates had improved dramatically, from less than 25% in unmodified Shermans to nearly 60% in those with Guyer's armor. As the North African campaign concluded with Allied victory, Guyer's modification finally received official attention from the highest levels. General George S. Patton, never one to ignore battlefield innovation, inspected several of the modified tanks during a tour of frontline units. Patton, who had lost numerous tanks and crews during the campaign, immediately recognized the value of Guyer's work. "Sometimes the best solutions come from the men who face the problem every day," Patton noted in his diary. "This sergeant has done more to protect our tankers with scrap metal and a welding torch than our entire ordnance department has managed with millions of dollars." Patton ordered a formal evaluation of the modification and directed that it be implemented across all Sherman tanks in his command if proven effective. The evaluation confirmed what frontline crews already knew. Guyer's improvised armor significantly improved crew survivability. The official report, submitted in June 1943, recommended immediate field implementation of similar modifications for all Shermans in the European theatre. The report was forwarded to the Ordnance Department with Patton's emphatic endorsement. Back in Washington, the reaction was mixed. Some officials were embarrassed that a sergeant's improvised solution had outperformed their official development programs. Others recognized the pragmatic value of the modification and sought to incorporate its principles into future tank designs. The debate became moot when photographs of Guyer's modified tanks reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower, who had begun his career in the Tank Corps during World War I and understood the terror of being inside a vulnerable armored vehicle, issued a direct order: implement this modification across all Sherman tanks in the European and Mediterranean theatres immediately. Priority goes to frontline units. With Eisenhower's endorsement, what had begun as one sergeant's unauthorized experiment became official U.S. Army policy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Army formalized Guyer's design into what became known as the Appliqué Armor Field Modification Kit. Mobile welding teams were dispatched to armored units across North Africa, Sicily, and later Italy, converting Shermans at an astonishing rate. Unlike typical military procurement programs that could take months or years to implement, WWII's solution was being applied to combat vehicles within weeks of official approval. The timing couldn't have been better. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, they would face some of Germany's most elite panzer units, equipped with the latest Tiger and Panther tanks. The improved Sherman survivability would prove critical in the coming battles. The impact was most visible in the statistics. In the 30 days following the widespread implementation of WWII's modification, approximately 800 Sherman tanks were engaged in combat operations across North Africa and Sicily. Of these, historians estimate that roughly half would have experienced catastrophic ammunition explosions if hit, based on previous combat data. Instead, the modified tanks showed a dramatic reduction in brewing up when penetrated by enemy fire. Conservative estimates suggest that over 400 catastrophic explosions were prevented during this period. With each tank carrying a 5-man crew and assuming 60% crew fatality in such explosions, the math is stunning. Approximately 2,400 American tankers survived encounters that would have killed them in unmodified Shermans. Curtis WWII himself never sought recognition for his innovation. When asked years later why he had risked his military career by defying direct orders, his answer was simple. I couldn't sleep at night knowing those boys were rolling into combat without a fighting chance. For his contributions, WWII was eventually awarded the Legion of Merit, but not until October 1944, more than a year after his improvisation began saving lives. The citation carefully avoided, mentioning that his initial work had been unauthorized, instead praising his technical ingenuity in improving armored vehicle survivability. The legacy of WWII's trash armor extended far beyond the immediate lives saved. The angular armor concept influenced the design of later American tanks, including the M26 Pershing, which featured sloped armor as a standard design element. More importantly, it demonstrated the value of battlefield innovation and the importance of listening to frontline troops' solutions. The U.S. Army subsequently established more formal channels for field modifications to be evaluated and implemented rapidly, without being bottlenecked by bureaucratic processes. Perhaps the most meaningful measure of WWII's impact came in the form of letters, hundreds of them, sent by tank crew members and their families after the war. One such letter, from the mother of a Sherman gunner, simply stated, "They tell me you're the man who saved my son's life with your special armor. I want you to know that every Christmas dinner he attends, every grandchild he will one day hold, every moment of his future exists because of what you did." Curtis WWII returned to Detroit after the war, resuming his work in the auto industry. He rarely spoke about his wartime innovations, preferring to leave those memories on the battlefields of North Africa. When asked about his greatest achievement, he would typically mention his 43 years of marriage or his 3 children rather than his military service. But among military historians and armor experts, WWII's improvised solution remains a classic example of battlefield ingenuity, saving lives when official processes could not move quickly enough. His story teaches us a timeless lesson that resonates far beyond military applications. Sometimes the most effective solutions come not from official channels, but from those directly facing the problem. Innovation often requires the courage to challenge established procedures and the willingness to act, even without authorization, when lives are at stake. Curtis WWII was not a general, a politician, or a famous inventor. He was simply a welder who refused to accept that nothing could be done to protect his fellow soldiers. In doing so, he demonstrated that one person with determination and practical skills can sometimes accomplish what entire institutions cannot. As modern armies continue to adapt to new threats and challenges, the spirit of WWII's innovation lives on in field modifications and rapid adaptation programs. His legacy reminds us that in warfare, as in many of life's challenges, waiting for perfect solutions often costs more than implementing good ones immediately. For the thousands of American tankers who survived the war because of angled armor welded onto their Shermans, WWII's imperfect but immediate solution made all the difference between life and death. The battlefield victories in North Africa and Sicily marked only the beginning of Gaia's innovations' impact. As the Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Italy in September 1943, a more standardized version of the trash armor modification was being implemented across the American armored divisions. No longer reliant on scavenged German armor plate, the US Army began manufacturing dedicated applique armor kits based on Gaia's original concept. These kits used American-made armor steel, cut and shaped specifically for application to vulnerable areas of the Sherman tank. Lieutenant Colonel James Burton, an Ordnance Corps officer who had initially been skeptical of field modifications, visited the assembly areas in Sicily where the new kits were being installed. "I came to criticize, but I'm leaving convinced," he wrote in his after-action report. The angular armor concept is sound engineering principles applied through practical battlefield experience. What's remarkable isn't just the technical and solution, but how quickly it moved from one welder's idea to theater-wide implementation. The Italian campaign would prove to be the ultimate test of Gaia's innovation. The mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula channeled armored movements through narrow valleys and passes, creating perfect ambush conditions for German anti-tank units. Without the improved survivability provided by the modified armor, American tank losses might have been catastrophically higher. Combat reports from the fighting around Monte Cassino in early 1944 highlighted numerous instances where crews survived hits that would have been fatal in unmodified vehicles. Sergeant Anthony Calaco, a Sherman tank commander with the 1st Armored Division, described one such encounter in a letter home. "We took a direct hit from what must have been an 88. The shell punched through our side armor, but then deflected upward through the top of the tank instead of hitting our ammo racks. All 5 of us walked away with just cuts and bruises. Our tank was finished, but we weren't. The boys in the maintenance battalion call it Gaia's gift. Whoever this Gaia fellow is, I owe him a lifetime of beers." By December 1943, the success of the field modification had caught the attention of British tank commanders, who faced the same vulnerability issues with their own Sherman tanks supplied through Lend-Lease. British Major Richard Belchambers of the Royal Tank Regiment made a special trip to American maintenance depots in Italy to observe the modification process. Impressed by what he saw, Belchambers arranged for British armour units to receive similar upgrades. "The Americans have developed an elegant solution to a problem we've all faced," Belchambers reported to his superiors. "Their approach emphasizes deflection rather than absorption, and it can be implemented in the field with minimal resources. I strongly recommend we adopt this technique immediately for all our Sherman regiments." The British took the concept even further, developing their own variant called the Sherman Firefly that not only incorporated angled armour protection, but also upgraded the main gun to a powerful 17-pounder anti-tank cannon. This combination of improved survivability and increased firepower transformed the Sherman into a vehicle capable of engaging even the most formidable German tanks. The Firefly would become one of the most effective Allied tanks of the later war years, a distant evolution of Gaia's original insight about angled armour. Back in the United States, the Ordnance Department was finally taking notice. What had begun as an unauthorized field modification had demonstrated such clear benefits that it could no longer be ignored by the military establishment. In February 1944, a team of engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground arrived in Italy to study the modified Shermans in combat conditions. Their findings were unequivocal. The angled armour significantly improved crew survivability without compromising the tank's mobility or reliability. The engineers' report, submitted to the Chief of Ordnance in March 1944, contained a surprisingly frank admission. The field expedient solution developed by maintenance personnel has proven more effective and certainly more timely than our official development programs. We recommend immediate incorporation of these principles into production vehicles and accelerated deployment of field modification kits to all theatres. Dr. Eleanor Thompson, the civilian metallurgist who led the evaluation team, was particularly impressed by the ingenuity of the solution. "What strikes me most is the elegant simplicity," she noted in her personal observations. "Rather than trying to make the armour thicker, which would have required completely new production tooling and added problematic weight, this sergeant understood that changing the angle of impact was far more efficient. It's a lesson in working with the constraints of the existing platform rather than demanding an entirely new one. As preparations accelerated for the invasion of France, the improved Sherman design took on even greater significance. Operation Overlord would pit American armour directly against some of Germany's most elite panzer divisions in the hedgerow country of Normandy. The success or failure of the Allied breakout from the beachhead would depend largely on the effectiveness of its armoured forces. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army for the invasion, made the armour modification a top priority. "Every Sherman that lands on those beaches will have the improved armour package," he insisted during planning meetings. "I won't send our tank crews into that fight without every advantage we can give them." Bradley had seen the casualty reports from North Africa before the modification was implemented, and he was determined not to repeat that bloody experience in France. True to Bradley's directive, the Shermans that rumbled ashore at Omaha and Utah beaches on June 6, 1944, carried the angular armour improvements that had begun with Guyer's workshop experiments. The modification had evolved substantially by this point, no longer crude plates welded at approximate angles, but precisely designed armour sections attached at carefully calculated deflection angles. Some now incorporated spaced armour concepts, with air gaps between layers to further disrupt incoming projectiles. The hedgerow battles of June and July 1944 put these improvements to their sternest test. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient earthen berms and thick vegetation, created perfect ambush terrain for German anti-tank units. Shermans would often round a corner to find themselves facing the long barrel of a concealed panther or tiger at point-blank range, precisely the scenario the armour improvements had been designed to mitigate. Master Sergeant Raymond Olson commanded a Sherman in the 2nd Armoured Division during the fighting around St. Lo. His account of a July 15th engagement illustrates the value of the modified armour. "We were moving through a narrow lane when a panther opened up from less than 200 yards. The first round hit us square in the right side. In the old days, that would have been it, brewing up and all of us cooked inside. Instead, the shell deflected through the upper portion of the fighting compartment. Our gunner lost his arm, but the rest of us made it out. The medics told us later that without that angled plate, none of us would have survived." As Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began the race across France, the improved Shermans continued to prove their worth. German after-action reports noted with frustration the decreasing effectiveness of their anti-tank tactics against American armour. A Panzer commander's assessment captured by Allied intelligence in August 1944 observed, "The American M4 tanks we face now are not the same vulnerable targets we encountered in Africa. Their modified armour configuration requires more precise shot placement to achieve destruction. Our gunners must now aim specifically for turret rings or lower hull sections to ensure a kill." Back at the Tank Automotive Center in Detroit, where Army production specialists worked alongside civilian automotive engineers, Curtis Guyer's innovation had sparked a broader reassessment of tank vulnerability. Colonel George Welby, the center's engineering director, launched a comprehensive study of battlefield tank losses that would ultimately influence not just immediate modifications but future tank designs. What began as a field expedient has evolved into a fundamental reconsideration of how we approach armour protection, Welby wrote in a September 1944 memo to the Chief of Ordnance. "The angular armour concept pioneered by Sergeant Guyer has demonstrated that effective protection is not simply a function of thickness, but of geometry and energy management. These principles will inform not just our current vehicles, but the next generation of American armour." True to Welby's prediction, the lessons of Guyer's innovation directly influenced the development of post-war American tank designs. The M26 Pershing, which began reaching combat units in the final months of the European campaign, featured comprehensively sloped armour as a fundamental design element rather than an afterthought. The later M46 Patton and M48 tanks continued this evolution, with their distinctively rounded turrets designed to maximize ballistic deflection at every angle. Yet for all the technical success of Guy's innovation, its greatest impact remained human, measured in lives saved rather than battles won. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany in early 1945, tank crews who had survived multiple hits attributed their continued existence to the improved armor. A study conducted by the Armored Medical Research Laboratory in March 1945 found that crew survival rates in penetrated Shermans had increased from approximately 25% in 1942 to nearly 65% by late 1944. The study's author, Major Philip Hastings, concluded, "No other single modification to American armored vehicles has saved more lives during this conflict." While the Sherman still suffers from fundamental limitations compared to the latest German tanks, the armor improvements have dramatically altered the survival equation for our crews. What began as a welder's improvisation has ultimately saved thousands of American lives. Curtis Guyer himself remained largely unaware of the full impact of his creation. By early 1945, he had been transferred back to the United States to train new welders in the specialized techniques required for the armor modification program. Based at the Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, he instructed hundreds of maintenance personnel who would carry his techniques to units throughout the European and Pacific theaters. One of his students, Private First Class Michael Donovan, recalled Guyer's teaching style. He never talked about himself or took credit for the armor design. He just focused on making sure we understood how to do the welding right. "The quality of your welds will determine whether some kid gets to go home to his mother," he would tell us. "Make every one count." It wasn't until after graduation that someone told us he was the guy who invented the whole system. As the war in Europe reached its climax in April and May 1945, American armor units engaged in their final battles against the remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht. In these desperate engagements, German forces deployed increasingly extreme anti-tank measures, including the Panzerfaust, a handheld, shaped charge weapon that could penetrate even the thickest tank armor at close range. Yet, even against these weapons, the modified Shermans demonstrated improved survivability. Captain Howard Reese, a company commander in the 4th Armored Division, described an engagement near Nuremberg. "We took 5 Panzerfaust hits in 15 minutes, moving through the city. 2 penetrated our armor, but because of the deflector plates, they didn't hit anything vital. In the old days, those would have gone straight into our ammunition stowage, and we'd have been finished. Instead, we kept fighting and completed our mission. Every man in my company knows that those welded plates are the reason we live to see VE Day." Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945, but for American tank forces in the Pacific Theater, the fight continued. The modified Shermans proved equally valuable in the brutal island-hopping campaign, where Japanese anti-tank tactics relied heavily on close-range attacks with shaped charge weapons and mines. On Okinawa, the war's last major battle, the improved survivability of American tanks saved countless crews during the savage fighting around Shuri Castle and the southern defense lines. After Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the U.S. Army began the massive process of evaluating the war's lessons. Among the thousands of after-action reports and technical assessments, the story of Guyer's armor modification stood out as a powerful example of battlefield innovation. Colonel James Miller, who led the Armored Vehicle Survivability Assessment Team, summarized the impact. "Perhaps no other field modification has had such profound effects on crew survivability. What started as a desperate measure by a single welder ultimately evolved into a system that saved thousands of American lives." The war's end brought recognition for many who had contributed to victory, but Curtis Guyer's role remained relatively obscure outside technical circles. His Legion of Merit, awarded in the final months of the war, cited his technical contributions to armored vehicle survivability without detailing the full scope of his impact. Like many of the war's quiet innovators, Gaia himself seemed uncomfortable with recognition, preferring to emphasize the collective achievement rather than his individual contribution. At a small ceremony at Fort Knox in September 1945, where he was presented with a commendation from the Tank Automotive Command, Gaia deflected praise to the welders who had implemented his design across thousands of vehicles. "I just had an idea," he told the assembled officers. "These boys made it happen in the field, often under fire, working through the night to protect their fellow soldiers. The credit belongs to them." After his discharge in December 1945, Gaia returned to Detroit and his former career in the automotive industry. He rarely spoke about his wartime innovations, even to family members. His daughter Eleanor later recalled, "Dad never talked much about the war. It wasn't until his funeral in 1986 that we learned the full story from some of his army buddies who attended. They told us that tank crews across Europe had called the armor modification Gaia's gift, and that it had saved thousands of lives. He never mentioned any of that to us." The true measure of Gaia's impact became clearer in the post-war years as military historians analyzed combat records and survival statistics. A 1952 Army study concluded that approximately 5,000 American tank crewmen had survived hits that would likely have been fatal in unmodified vehicles. For each of these survivors, there was a family spared the grief of loss, children who grew up with fathers rather than gold stars in their windows, the communities that welcomed home young men who would otherwise have been names on memorial plaques. James Cullen was one such survivor. A loader in a Sherman with the 3rd Armored Division, he took a German 88 round through his tank during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The shell penetrated the hull but deflected away from the ammunition storage thanks to the angled armor plate. Kiernan survived with minor injuries and returned home to Boston after the war, where he became a high school teacher and raised 4 children. 60 years later, in 2004, Kiernan's grandson Michael discovered Curtis Gaia's name while researching a college paper on World War II innovation. Making the connection to his grandfather's survival story, Michael traced Gaia's family to Michigan and wrote them a letter. "Your father never met my grandfather, but without his invention, our family wouldn't exist," Michael wrote. "The 43 years my grandfather taught history, his 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and now 2 great-grandchildren are all part of Curtis Gaia's legacy. We owe our existence to a welder who refused to accept the status quo." The Kiernan family was just one of thousands whose futures hinged on Gaia's innovation. Across America, the generations that flourished in the post-war prosperity included many who would never have been born if not for a maintenance sergeant's refusal to accept the limitations of standard military equipment. This human legacy, impossible to quantify precisely but profound in its implications, represents the true significance of battlefield innovation. In the decades following the war, the principles Gaia pioneered became standard practice in armored vehicle design worldwide. The M1 Abrams tank, America's current main battle tank, incorporates complex composite armor arranged at precise angles to maximize deflection of incoming rounds, a sophisticated evolution of the same fundamental concept. When modern tank crews survive battlefield hits in Iraq or Afghanistan, they are beneficiaries of a protection philosophy that traces directly back to those makeshift modifications in the Tunisian desert. Perhaps the most important legacy of Gaia's story isn't technical but institutional. The US military, learning from the experience, established more responsive channels for battlefield innovation in subsequent conflicts. The rapid equipping force created during the Iraq War, which rushed soldier-inspired innovations to the battlefield, and the Army's current cross-functional teams that bring together users and developers, both reflect lessons learned from the Sherman armor experience, that those closest to the problem often have the most practical solutions, and that bureaucratic processes must sometimes yield to battlefield realities. Dr. Harold Collins, a military historian who documented the Sherman's evolution, observed, "What makes Gaia's story so compelling is not just the technical achievement but the human element, a single individual who saw young men dying, unnecessarily, and refused to accept that nothing could be done." His willingness to risk his military career to save others embodies the best traditions of American ingenuity and moral courage. The story of Curtis Geyer and his trash armor reminds us of a profound truth about warfare and innovation. In the complex ecosystem of military technology, the most consequential improvements often come not from elaborate research programs or defense contractors, but from the practical insights of those who use the equipment daily. The grease-stained hands of maintenance crews, the battlefield observations of combat soldiers, and the improvised solutions of frontline units frequently contribute more to survival than the polished presentations of procurement officials. For the modern military, the lesson is clear. Listen to your sergeants. Create pathways for bottom-up innovation. Recognize that the welder noticing a pattern of tank destruction may have more practical wisdom than the committee. Designing the next-generation vehicle. Battlefield innovation isn't just about better equipment. It's about respecting the intelligence and creativity of every soldier in the chain of command. As for Curtis Geyer himself, his legacy lives on not just in tank design principles or military innovation programs, but in the generations of Americans who owe their very existence to his refusal to accept unnecessary death. The thousands of tank crewmen who survived because of angled armor, returned home, built careers, raised families, and contributed to the America we know today. Their children and grandchildren walk among us, living testaments to the power of one person to change the course of countless lives through practical innovation and moral courage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.